Perfecto.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias por estar aquí en esta Pamplona fría y nublada. Empezamos, como sabéis, bueno, los que no sabéis os lo digo, este es el evento final del proyecto Open to Preser, que es un evento que se celebraron 2 primeras jornadas en Almería. Estuvimos el lunes y el martes en Almería explicando parte de los resultados de este proyecto más relacionados con las áreas mediterráneas. Y entonces empezamos hoy lo que será la difusión de este evento en Navarra, en lo que se explicarán sobre todo las experiencias que se han realizado en zonas de clima atlántico. Tenemos esta primera sesión hoy, que será una sesión pues, de muchas conferencias, una jornada muy densa. Falta parte del partenariado Open to Preser porque ayer llegamos por la noche muy tarde y van a llegar, pues van a ir llegando a lo largo de la mañana. Y después mañana, como sabéis, tenemos una sesión de campo que además parece que el tiempo va a respetar. No va ni llover a cántaros ni va a nevar. O sea que con un poco de suerte no habrá tampoco niebla y podremos visitar también experiencias pilotos relacionadas con este proyecto. Para este acto inaugural contamos con la presencia de los 2 organismos que han apoyado desde el momento cero este proyecto. La Universidad Pública de Navarra, que es la coordinadora del proyecto, e INTIA, el Instituto INTIA, pues que es el socio regional de la Universidad Pública de Navarra en este proyecto. Tenemos con nosotros al vicerrector de investigación, Patxi Arregui, que va a empezar diciéndonos unas palabras.
Buenos días, egunon, bonjour, bon día. En nombre del rector y de toda la comunidad universitaria que conformamos la Universidad Pública de Navarra, queremos daros la bienvenida en este evento que entendemos que tanto para cualquier tipo de entidad, organismo o individuo que tenga inquietudes en la preservación del medio natural, pues le va a resultar de alto interés. Quiero agradecer a la coordinadora del proyecto, a la profesora Rosa Canals, su presencia, por supuesto a nuestros socios de INTIA dentro del proyecto y a la directora del Instituto ISFUD, ¿no? Que es el instituto donde están enmarcados pues, nuestros investigadores que participan en el proyecto. Bueno, comentar que este proyecto, que trata de alguna manera de mantener de forma sostenible paisajes, ¿no? de mosaico combinado, si no recuerdo mal, se enmarca dentro de lo que son los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible, los famosos ODS, que estaréis viendo seguramente en todos los sitios, con muchas señalizaciones y muchos colores variados. Pues lo que es la conservación del medio ambiente, la verdad es que tiene un ODS particular, ¿no? Que es el número 15, el de vida de ecosistemas terrestres, y además aparecen otros. Esto significa, los ODS son unos objetivos marcados por las Naciones Unidas y esto significa que son unos objetivos que son internacionales e intergeneracionales. Va más allá del interés de los individuos, va más allá de los intereses de las regiones, de un país, y va más allá incluso de nuestra propia época. Es algo que trasciende a nosotros y a las generaciones que vendrán más adelante. Entonces, en este marco, ¿no? En el que digamos que toda la humanidad nos podemos estar alineando, ya vemos, por ejemplo, las consecuencias de lo que es el cambio climático, ¿no? Y otras consecuencias de nuestro propio comportamiento como seres humanos, pues bueno, en este alineamiento que intentamos todos buscar, qué mejor manera que apostar por proyectos transfronterizos con equipos multidisciplinares en los que se pueden encontrar sinergias que sirva para un crecimiento tanto a nivel individual como a nivel grupal, como a nivel, como decíamos, internacional, y en los que se puede aprovechar, primero, la generación de conocimiento que se produce en instituciones como la universidad o en otros centros especializados, y además ponerlo en práctica en campo, ¿no? Yo creo que esto es como cerrar ese círculo virtuoso en el que se genera conocimiento de algo que se quiere transformar, se pone en práctica y se llega a transformar. Entonces, en ese sentido, lo que también os recomiendo, porque a mí me resultó muy estimulante, fue que para los que no lo hayáis hecho, ¿no? En la propia página web del proyecto, open2preserve.eu, pues que echéis un vistazo porque la verdad es que es muy interesante y puedes ver de una pincelada bastantes de las actividades que se han realizado en el proyecto. Y por mi parte nada más, pues daros la bienvenida y espero que disfrutéis mucho en estas jornadas de hoy y mañana. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Pachi. Cedemos la palabra a Luis Orcaray, que es responsable de experimentación y proyectos de INTIA y que, como comentábamos hace un momento, también fue alumno de esta Escuela de Agrónomos de la Universidad Pública de Navarra.
Sí, bueno, yo lo primero también agradecer a todos los que habéis participado y bueno, los que habéis venido hoy, sobre todo los que habéis venido de fuera y a todos los que habéis participado en el proyecto y a la UPNA por organizarlo. Recordar que esto viene ya de antes de una colaboración que tuvimos en 2013, o sea que es un tema que venimos trabajando desde largo plazo y esperemos seguir trabajando en él. También agradecer que pasamos de ese pequeño proyecto regional a habéis sido capaces de, como decía Pachi, de juntar ya a 3 países, a 13 socios para llevar esto adelante, para ver cómo hace cada uno y simplemente, pues nada, que espero que las jornadas de hoy sean provechosas para todos, que seguro que lo van a ser y nada más, agradeceros de nuevo haber venido aquí.
Gracias. Y finalmente cedo la palabra a Idoia Lavallen, que es la directora del Instituto de Investigación ISFood, donde está acogido el grupo de investigación que participa en este proyecto.
Buenos días, Según, bonjour, buen día. Lo primero, agradeceros a todos, ponentes y asistentes, vuestra participación en la jornada y muy especialmente a Rosa María Canals y a su equipo por la organización. Lo han hecho estupendamente y además me consta que con algunas dificultades ayer por la noche para llegar a tiempo. Yo lo que sí que me gustaría transmitiros es la importancia que ha tenido este proyecto en ISFood. Consideramos que es un proyecto importante y estratégico en el instituto, que se alinea, como decía el vicerrector, con líneas estratégicas, no solo en Navarra, sino a nivel europeo e internacional de sostenibilidad. Y desde luego que vamos a tratar con todo el cariño para que esto no sea un punto final, sino que sea un punto y seguido y que se pueda aprovechar esta jornada para mantener esa colaboración e impulsar proyectos en el futuro. Nada más, yo solo os deseo que disfrutéis de la jornada y también deseo, como decía Rosa María, que mañana tengamos un día medianamente agradable porque llevamos un mes muy malo. Espero que mañana pues, bueno, nos dé un respiro y que se pueda disfrutar de esa visita a Roncesvalles, a Orreaga. Es que ricasco de hoy.
Bueno, pues con esto quedan inauguradas este evento final. Hace 4 años no nos lo imaginábamos que íbamos a llegar aquí. Hemos pasado por una pandemia, por un montón de situaciones complicadas y la verdad es que tiene mucho mérito poderlo hacer presencial. Y os agradezco a todos que estáis aquí, sobre todo los que no sois de la región, porque yo creo que al final uno ve la televisión y se asusta una barbaridad y dice, ¿cómo se me ocurre irme a Navarra? Entonces, bueno, muchas gracias a los que estáis aquí y también muchas gracias a los que nos siguen online. Sabemos que es complicado y también por las fechas, porque estamos ya a una semana de Navidad y las agendas suelen estar muy apretadas. Muchas gracias a todos y esperamos que os sea muy provechoso.
Bueno, buenos días a todos. Yo soy Leire Mújica, trabajo aquí en la Universidad Pública de Navarra, en el grupo de Rosa Canals, titular de universidad aquí en la Universidad Pública de Navarra y coordinadora del proyecto Open to Preserve. Nosotras pertenecemos al grupo de Ecología y Medio Ambiente y trabajamos en el área de sistemas forestales abiertos, matorrales y pastos. Así que nada, Rosa, cuando quieras va a realizar la presentación del proyecto.
Bueno, pues quizás el primer paso es dedicar un tiempo a presentar lo que es la justificación. ¿Se me oye? ¿Sí? ¿Sí? Ah, vale. Bueno, pues... Ay, pero rebota un poco el ruido. Ah, los de mesa es... ¿Sí? Ahora bien. Vale, muchas gracias. Bueno, pues lo primero es presentar un poco lo que es el proyecto y qué es lo que nos llevó pues, a decidir hacer esta experimentación en concreto, ¿no? Esta combinación de dos técnicas diferentes, que es utilizar el fuego técnico y utilizar el herbívoro. Como ha comentado Leire, nosotros venimos de un grupo de ecología y medio ambiente, y aunque tratamos de hacer y buscamos hacer ecología aplicada, sí que es cierto que para nosotros pues, una buena base ecológica es necesaria, ¿no? para poder hacer otros pasos, ¿no? Para poder ir un poco más allá. Y un poco lo que voy a tratar de hacer ahora, si me dejan para pasar. Es este, vale. Bien. Vale, este es el índice de la presentación. Primero hablaremos un poco del paisaje y del papel que ha tenido la interacción fuego-herbívoro en ese paisaje. Después introduciremos el concepto de herbivorismo pírico. Es un concepto que yo oí hablar por primera vez o lo vi escrito por primera vez de un investigador que va a venir, que nos va a dar una charla, lo vamos a tener dentro de un rato con nosotros, D.Fuhlendorf. Y después os voy a hablar cómo a partir de estas ideas anteriores surge esta idea de proyecto Open to Preserve. Bien, creo que una investigación clave muy importante, que además está difundida en un libro muy interesante, es la de este ecólogo holandés, Vera, que hizo una tesis al inicio del siglo XXI, estudiando desde diferentes frentes y desde diferentes puntos de vista cómo había sido el paisaje europeo cuando Homo sapiens llegó hace 50.000 años aquí. Se basó en diferentes tipos de estudios muy interesantes, los combinó, pero quizás el más impactante precisamente fueron los estudios de polen fósil. Lo que hizo fue volver a coger todos esos datos que ya se habían trabajado antes en generaciones anteriores sobre los registros y los depósitos de polen fósil que había en Europa, para a través de ese material predecir cómo había sido el paisaje cuando nosotros llegamos aquí. Y realmente lo que vio es que hace 10.000 años Cuando empezó el periodo que vivimos actualmente, tras la última glaciación, los contenidos de polen de especies arbóreas eran altos, pero se podían distinguir, los métodos que existen actualmente permitían distinguir e identificar diferentes tipos de polenes de arbóreas. Y se veía que los contenidos en concreto, los contenidos de avellano eran muy altos. El avellano es una especie que se relaciona generalmente con las orlas de bosque, con las zonas abiertas, donde se recibe una iluminación, lo cual ya le estaba indicando que el paisaje europeo era probablemente más abierto de lo que nos habíamos imaginado. Él lo definió como un park grass landscape, podríamos llamarlo como una especie de sabana, un espacio donde realmente las gramíneas y las herbáceas podían tener una importancia grande. También lo que vio es que este polen no arbóreo, el polen que no proviene de especies arbóreas, sino que es de especies herbáceas, está generalmente infrarrepresentado, ¿de acuerdo? Y no se relaciona directamente con la cantidad de espacios abiertos. Eso lo hizo comprobando espectros polínicos actuales de paisajes conocidos con espectros polínicos fósiles, ¿de acuerdo? Generalmente la cantidad de polen que proviene de especies de gramíneas es muy bajo, lo cual tiene su sentido. Son polen de menor tamaño, muchas especies de gramíneas se reproducen vegetativamente, quizás no llegan a florecer y realmente las condiciones hacen pues, que sea un polen que no nos esté reflejando realmente la cantidad de recubrimiento de esta especie en otros tiempos. También de su investigación doctoral concluyó que dos perturbaciones habían sido claves en la creación de este paisaje abierto, y eran el fuego y era el herbivorismo, ¿de acuerdo? Las dos son dos perturbaciones que son consumidoras de vegetación. Al final, un poco, pues la idea que se desprende es que nosotros llegamos aquí, vimos estas perturbaciones, cómo actuaban en el paisaje, y lo que hicimos fue ampliar, acrecentar ese mosaico, ¿no? Llevando el fuego en el paisaje y utilizando al herbívoro, ¿de acuerdo? Esto se ha visto en Europa y se ha visto también en otros continentes. Se ha visto, por ejemplo, también desde el prisma de la ecología evolutiva. Un gran investigador que trabajó en los años 80, McNaughton, en la sabana africana, pues llegó desde el punto de vista de la biología evolutiva, es decir, de cómo se adaptan las plantas a las perturbaciones predominantes durante su vida, durante su desarrollo. Esa sería un poco la idea. Lo que comprobó desde ese prisma es que la mayor parte de las adaptaciones que tenían los vegetales desde producción de toxinas, de compuestos secundarios, de estructuras mecánicas de defensa, eran mecanismos de defensa al herbívoro. E incluso muchos de estos tipos de mecanismos es difícil a veces adivinar si es una protección o una adaptación al herbívoro o al fuego. Muchas de ellas pueden tener esa doble función. De alguna manera todo eso también le llevó a concluir lo mismo, que el rol de los herbívoros y del fuego había sido clave en la creación de hábitats en el Serengeti. En España tenemos otro gran ecólogo que estudia mucho el fuego, que es Juli García Pausas, que trabaja en Valencia y trabajando con esta misma idea ha ido un poco más allá. Vamos poco a poco añadiendo conceptos. Él lo que dice es que estas dos perturbaciones están interconectadas porque comparten el mismo recurso, eso lo veíamos antes, la biomasa vegetal, pero además lo que ha visto con estudios realizados con registros muy antiguos, también de polen fósil, es que bajos niveles, que el herbivorismo mantiene bajos niveles de biomasa vegetal, lo que limita el tamaño y la intensidad de los incendios. Y en épocas de la historia donde ha habido una gran actividad de megaherbívoros, han habido menos incendios y viceversa. ¿De acuerdo? Existe una conexión entre estas dos perturbaciones controlando la gestión de la biomasa vegetal. Y aquí también, esta es una información que él añadió recientemente en un blog que tiene muy interesante, basado también en un artículo que ha publicado hace muy poco. Incluso pues, se atreve a establecer unas teorías acerca precisamente del ciclo de la materia. ¿De acuerdo? Al final, una materia vegetal o bien se descompone, o bien es consumida por un herbívoro, o bien es quemada. Esos serían los 3 grandes procesos que tenemos de ciclo de la materia. Y al final, en un gradiente de humedad, de presencia de agua, de disponibilidad de agua, y en un gradiente de fertilidad, dominan más unos procesos u otros, ¿no? A grandes rasgos. En lugares muy húmedos y de buenas temperaturas dominan procesos de descomposición. En lugares intermedios dominan procesos de incendios. Para que haya un incendio tiene que haber suficiente biomasa. En ambientes muy secos, muy áridos, donde casi no hay producción vegetal, tampoco hay incendios. ¿De acuerdo? Y el herbivorismo tendría su máximo también un poco antes. Esa es una teoría también, me parece muy interesante. Digo esto porque yo creo que el ser humano que habitamos el planeta en el siglo XXI no nos damos cuenta de que probablemente si llegara un Homo sapiens aquí y empezara un Homo sapiens prehistórico y empezara a pasear por nuestros bosques y nuestro entorno natural, probablemente la primera impresión que tendría y el primer shock que tendría es ver que no existen herbívoros en ese paisaje, que no existen animales. ¿De acuerdo? Porque probablemente lo que encontramos era un hábitat, era un ambiente muy habitado por animales. No sé si conocéis el registro fósil de fonelas, es como si fuera una tapuerca, pero de especies animales. Es un registro que está en la cuenca del Guadix y que se descubrió no hace mucho tiempo y que se va trabajando en él, pero poco a poco. Aún queda mucho por descubrir. Es un registro fósil del final del Plioceno, inicio del Pleistoceno, en una época en que se creía que había ya una diversificación y desarrollo de especies de mamíferos herbívoros. Era una zona de comedero y refugio de hienas y por lo tanto hay una acumulación muy grande de huesos y de restos de los animales que comían estas hienas, ¿no? Entonces, las grandes conclusiones de lo poco que han estudiado aún es que se han descubierto especies que no se sabía que estaban en Europa, ¿de acuerdo? Se han identificado nuevas especies y también cronológicamente especies que se pensaban extinguidas, se ha visto que existían aún en ese periodo o viceversa. Es decir, que un poco nos ha dicho que estamos en mantillas en cuanto al conocimiento de esos mamíferos que estaban aprovechando, ¿no? Y viviendo en nuestro paisaje. De todas esas especies, de esos fósiles identificados, el 60,5% pertenecen al orden Artiodactya, es decir, son herbívoros. Por lo tanto, pues un poco esa idea que os estaba transmitiendo, ¿no? Por supuesto que casi todos ellos extinguidos, ¿de acuerdo? Y los que no domesticados. Pero no hace falta encontrar registros fósiles como este tan impresionante de fonelas como para darnos cuenta de esta realidad, ¿de acuerdo? Tenemos aquí muy cerca a cuevas rupestres, tenemos por ejemplo en el sur de Francia las cuevas de Lascaux. No sé si habéis tenido oportunidad de visitarlas y si no os las recomiendo porque son impresionantes. Y tenemos por ejemplo pues también tenemos las de la cornisa cantábrica, que hay muchas, y aquí os pongo un ejemplo también de Abrigo Grande, de unas cuevas de arte levantino en la zona de Levante, ¿no? Con la datación de la antigüedad. Lo que pintaban nuestros antepasados es lo que veían en el paisaje y lo que creían que era importante ese paisaje. Y lo que pintaban eran animales, un montón de animales, una barbaridad de animales, ¿de acuerdo? Con unos años empezamos a pintar pantócratos y después empezamos a pintar al hombre, ¿no? Quizás estoy exagerando, pero sí que creo que ver estas pinturas y cómo hemos ido cambiando lo que pintamos nos está hablando mucho de nosotros, ¿no? De cómo contemplamos nuestra relación con nuestro entorno. En el Neolítico se produce la gran domesticación de herbívoros salvajes. que llevó pues, a que muchas especies, pues, como el uro, el tarpán, ¿no?, se extinguieran y pasaran o se domesticaran, ¿no? Pasaran algunas a convertirse en animales domésticos, en antecesores de nuestros animales domésticos actuales. Se domesticó a un grupo muy específico de animales. Se domesticó a los pastoreadores, a animales que aprovechaban sobre todo el recurso de la hierba, ¿de acuerdo?, más que el ramoneo, más que el recurso arbustivo. Eran animales que eran muy predecibles de movimientos porque estaban en espacios abiertos, iban buscando el pasto en función de las diferentes épocas de producción en que éste entraba en producción, y iban en grupos, iban en rebaños, por lo tanto era mucho más fácil cazarlos y domesticarlos que otras especies que se han mantenido salvajes, de especies ramoneadoras, que van en grupos pequeños, que viven dentro de bosques, que tienen un comportamiento diferente, ¿vale? Entonces, a partir de ese momento, la ganadería extensiva pasó a ocupar el nicho ecológico que dejaron esas grandes manadas de herbívoros pastoreadores y, por lo tanto, pasaron a cubrir su función y valor ecosistémico. Realmente yo creo pues, que durante todos estos siglos que hemos tenido y milenios de evolución de la ganadería extensiva, aquellas personas que se han dedicado a esa ganadería extensiva no han sido conscientes en absoluto de ese papel ecosistémico que estaban jugando. Muchas veces, por nuestra manera de ser, nos damos cuenta de las cosas cuando esas cosas empiezan a fallar. Es ahora que estamos empezando a hablar de herbivorismo ambiental, de servicios ecosistémicos, y nos damos cuenta ahora que están desapareciendo esas explotaciones de ganadería extensiva, lo importantes que son, ¿de acuerdo? Estamos precisamente en ese punto, en que yo creo que hay personas una minoría que lo tiene muy claro, un sector que va claramente en declive, ¿no?, y de una sociedad desinformada y muy urbana, a la que tenemos que convencer de que eso es un auténtico problema, ¿no? Estas predicciones, pues muchos de los que estáis aquí o todos ya las conoceréis, ¿no?, como los animales que están más relacionados con una ganadería extensiva, que sería el vacuno de carne y el ovino y caprino de carne, como son sectores que van claramente en declive en la Unión Europea. Mientras que los sectores de monogástricos o asociados a otras producciones, a las producciones lácteas, pues más o menos se pueden sostener. Pero es cierto que aquellos más ligados al aprovechamiento del pasto en pastoreo, ¿no?, pues realmente están en declive. Y la consecuencia es esto, es un paisaje que está cambiando y que está teniendo síntomas claros de lo que está ocurriendo, ¿no? Aquí tenemos fotos con áreas donde se está produciendo mucha acumulación de combustible. No es difícil hacer fotografías de este tipo para nada. Es fácil encontrar este paisaje en muchos lugares. Estas imágenes que tenemos abajo corresponden a zonas del Pirineo. Esto es el Valle de Tena. Se ven zonas que habían sido abancaladas, que habrían sido aprovechadas en su momento, probablemente para cultivos de centeno, de cereal, que después se transformaron en praderías, y vemos ya cómo claramente están entrando los arbustos y también se está reforestando, se está forestando por pinos, y en cuestión pues, de 10 años será una cubierta pues, bastante continua, ¿no? Vemos allí en mano derecha, la foto inferior, también pues, una imagen del Valle Roncal, de la cabecera del Valle Roncal, a final de temporada de pastoreo, en pleno septiembre-octubre. Vemos una comunidad de un pasto de mucha calidad, de muy buen valor forrajero, que está completamente seco y agostado, y que no ha estado aprovechado por ningún animal durante toda la temporada. Un pasto que costó mucho llegar a él, porque las especies que hay en él son especies forrajeras de mucho valor, que solamente aparecen cuando hay una acción óptima y continuada del ganado a lo largo de mucho tiempo. Bueno, todos estos conceptos en los años 90, en la década de 2000, pues los empezó a modernizar o a llamarles de alguna manera Samuel Fuhlendorf, uno de los conferenciantes que nos va a acompañar hoy, ¿de acuerdo? Un poco gracias a él tenemos el término, acuñó el término de herbivorismo pírico, que lo que trata es de promover el uso del fuego y del herbívoro emulando los procesos naturales que, como hemos visto, crearon y mantuvieron los espacios naturales que hemos heredado. Él considera, y nosotros consideramos también, que la clave es la combinación de prácticas, y sobre todo el papel del ganado consolidador de ese paisaje a lo largo del tiempo. Esto es muy importante porque, aunque hay comunidades autónomas, hoy ya hablaremos de eso, y regiones donde se realizan quemas controladas, esa segunda parte, la parte del herbívoro actuando año tras año, ejerciendo ese papel de consolidador de un paisaje, no se tiene suficientemente en cuenta. Y eso está provocando muchos problemas, ¿no? Está provocando pues, que si solo se quema, al cabo de un par de años, 3 años en zonas atlánticas, volvamos a estar prácticamente en la situación de partida. Por lo tanto, que sean quemas de muy baja eficiencia, que nos obliga a repetir prácticas continuadas, con todo el coste económico, el riesgo que puede haber, porque una quema siempre es un riesgo, por mucho que se controle, siempre hay un factor de riesgo allí. Y también desde el punto de vista ambiental, quemas muy frecuentes pueden provocar problemas en el suelo, por ejemplo, en la vegetación, cambios en la vegetación. Y también está provocando pues, lo que está pasando, por ejemplo, en Francia, nuestros colegas del sur de Francia, y eso lo veremos también cuando vayamos mañana a salir al campo. Existe mucha tradición en el uso del fuego técnico en invierno, pero es cierto que si las zonas que se queman después no se pastorean lo suficiente y obliga a hacer quemas muy frecuentes, en algunos momentos se pueden producir pues, unas condiciones y unos efectos negativos, unas nubes de humo que se expanden territorios muy amplios, que están llegando pues, a que la opinión pública en Francia cada vez esté más en contra del uso del fuego técnico. Porque realmente no se está empleando bien, no se está empleando combinado con una práctica que lo haga eficiente. Y además las quemas controladas hoy, no lo olvidemos, son peligrosas. Es decir, aunque cada vez se conoce más el uso del fuego, también es cierto que cada vez hay mayores acumulaciones de combustible en el paisaje, cada vez los combustibles están más secos, tenemos altas temperaturas, menores humedades y hace pues, que sea un proceso que pueda ser complejo hacerlo bien. Bien, con todas estas ideas en mente, pues surge este proyecto, el proyecto Pen2Preser, que lo que busca es crear un modelo de gestión basado en estas dos prácticas combinadas para emular la dinámica natural, porque las prácticas, como hemos comentado, aisladas y sobre todo y en concreto el uso del fuego técnico es cuestionable desde diferentes puntos de vista. Y algo muy importante que no hemos hablado aún es que existe conocimiento científico técnico en ambos campos, pero que no se comparte. Los que son profesionales de uso de fuego no saben de ganadería y los profesionales de la ganadería no saben de uso de fuego técnico. Antes, cuando eran quemas tradicionales, sí que era algo que estaba ligado. Las hacían los ganaderos que sabían usar el fuego, sabían cuál era el mejor momento para quemar un arbusto, para que su rebrote fuera inferior, para que esa quema la pudiera controlar más fácilmente, etcétera. Todo ese conocimiento heredado, al irnos especializando, pues es cierto que se ha ido como perdiendo y disociando. Unos saben de una cosa y los otros saben de la otra. Y también en este proyecto, y también de eso nos hablarán hoy nuestros colegas portugueses, es que para que esto funcione tienen que ser modelos que tengan una viabilidad económica, ¿no? Que muestren soluciones de valorización de los productos que se obtienen de ese modelo de gestión, como pueden ser productos ganaderos, carne, queso, derivados de alta calidad o empresas de servicios de pastoreo, como es por ejemplo la rapta. Hoy hablaremos de estos ejemplos. Podemos decir que hay algunas regiones que estos temas los tienen mucho más trabajados que otras, ¿no? Una de las conclusiones y que quizás veréis a lo largo del día de hoy es cómo, a pesar de ocupar un espacio pequeño, toda región sudé no parece que sea tan grande en un mapa del mundo, realmente hay una heterogeneidad muy grande tanto en el uso de fuego como en las regulaciones, como en el uso del herbívoro. Eso lo iremos viendo. Si no es rentable, difícilmente podrá generar riqueza y, por otro lado, es imprescindible fijar una población ligada al territorio, ¿de acuerdo? Y que use los recursos naturales. No es solamente importante que haya una población que viva en el territorio, sino que es igual de importante que esté aprovechando los recursos que les dé ese territorio. El turismo no lo hace, o no lo hace de una manera como lo hace el sector primario, como lo hace un aprovechamiento forestal, un aprovechamiento agrícola, un aprovechamiento ganadero. Esos están gestionando los recursos que hay en el entorno. El equipo parece que lo hayan hecho expresamente porque van entrando, parece que ya van llegando más socios del proyecto. Es un equipo de 13 socios, tenemos 2 equipos portugueses, tenemos 3 equipos franceses y tenemos el resto de equipos españoles de 4 regiones. De la región de Galicia, de la región de Andalucía, de Cataluña y de Navarra. También tenemos un partenariado asociado muy extenso formado por 22 organismos. Este proyecto se concedió en la segunda convocatoria SUDOE con una ayuda FEDER importante, bastante dinero, aunque es cierto que también éramos el proyecto con un mayor número de socios, por lo tanto dinero para repartir. Y en principio empezó en marzo del 2018 y tenía que acabar en febrero de este año, pero por la situación que vivimos, pues se pidió una prórroga, porque sobre todo queríamos intentar que las actividades de difusión de proyecto, que se han realizado varias a lo largo de este año, fueran en la medida de lo posible presenciales, ¿no? Por la importancia que creemos que es primero que haya un contacto directo entre las personas y que después se puedan ir a visitar las zonas de experimentación. Y con esto acabaré esta presentación, con esta imagen, donde lo que tenemos son las 8 experiencias piloto que hemos establecido en el territorio. ¿De acuerdo? Son 5 experiencias, trabajan ganado ovino, básicamente son las ubicadas en zonas mediterráneas, excepto una experiencia que está en el Pirineo francés atlántico, porque es una zona donde existe mucha tradición de ovino y por lo tanto se mantuvo esta especie y hay especies autóctonas, razas autóctonas, adaptadas a ello. Y después tenemos 3 experiencias de equino, que son las de Galicia, de norte de Portugal, de la Universidad de Trasomontes y de Navarra. Y aquí veis cómo hemos estado en ambientes pues, muy diferentes, desde zonas, todos son ambientes de montaña. Las experiencias están establecidas en zonas protegidas con diferentes figuras de protección, desde reservas de la biosfera hasta figuras de protección nacionales, hasta figuras de protección europea, CEX. Hemos estado trabajando también diferentes CEX, con comunidades vegetales muy diferentes. Vamos a presentar a lo largo del día de hoy las experiencias que se han realizado sobre todo en la zona atlántica. Y esto sería todo. Muchas gracias por estar aquí en esta charla y yo creo que al menos ha servido como una primera pincelada para que os hagáis una idea de lo que os podéis encontrar y de qué nos llevó a diseñar este proyecto, ¿no? Qué preocupaciones y qué conceptos nos llevaron a hacer lo que hicimos. Eso es todo.
A continuar con la primera ponencia. Nos vais a dar un par de minutos para que preparemos la presentación. Bueno, vamos a comenzar ya con la primera ponencia. El ponente que tenemos invitado es Samuel Fuhlendorf, del que ya ha hablado Rosa. Samuel es catedrático en la Universidad de Oklahoma, donde ha desarrollado gran parte de su investigación sobre el estudio del papel de la heterogeneidad creada por perturbaciones, como es el herbivorismo pírico, la conservación de pastos mediante esta técnica o la ecología del fuego, entre otros temas. Sam ya estuvo con nosotros en Almería, donde explicó aspectos más técnicos del herbivorismo pírico, y hoy hará una introducción al aspecto socioecológico del herbivorismo pírico.
Good morning. Oh, that's loud. I'm sorry. Before I get started, I just want to say this has been a wonderful week. The people that I've been able to meet have been amazing. I'm so honored to be here. And most of the people that I've met, or all of the people that I've met, I've been overwhelmed with how kind everyone has been to me. So I'm very grateful and honored to be here. It's an amazing place. So thank you. And part of the adventure we were on had me on a bus last night, and when I probably should have been working on my talk, but I finished this morning what I was supposed to finish last night. But I'm glad to be here, and I look forward to interacting more in the future or later today. What I want to talk about today is I want to talk about a perspective that I presented somewhat in the last meeting, and it is that I always joke that I'm a reformed ecologist, that I started out studying things often because I didn't really want to be around a lot of people, I think. And I wanted to be out in the wilds of the world. But I eventually found out what most people already know, and that is that it's really, if you're interested in the natural world, it's still all about the people, and it's the people that actually matter. And the landscapes that we look at and think of scientifically, it's a major mistake to exclude people from those discussions. And that's something that's a dominant feature in U.S. conservation community, is everything that people do is bad. So let's try and stop that and save ecosystems, which it's easy to see how someone could come to that conclusion, but I don't think it's very effective. So I want to talk about that, and I want to, it's hard to talk about cultural landscapes without talking about a specific place. And so I'm going to focus today mostly on a place that I have worked, which is in North America. And I started my career on the left. And recently I've been working, which is near Mexico. And I've recently been working way far north in the northern part of Canada. So, but all through the central part of North America. And I'll talk briefly about that some more. In the States, it's hard to talk about landscape ecology or management without talking about energy development. That was really why I included these pictures, whether it's wind or oil and gas. That has become a dominant feature in future landscapes that's going to occur in North America. So yesterday in the airport, I received a paper that just came out this week, or just yesterday actually, and it's a good start for what I want to talk about today. the issue in the States is that the central part of North America is transitioning, and it's transitioning to a lot of things. The natural parts are transitioning largely to a woodland. But then we're also having this energy development. So it's sort of like we have state changes that are occurring. And if we're not careful, it's going to go one of two areas. And those two areas are beneficial to some people, but may not be beneficial to everyone that's interested. So this particular paper includes some discussion of Pyric herbivory and things related to this meeting, but it's largely focused on limiting woody plant encroachment. And I'm going to talk about that. I mostly study disturbances, but I'm very interested in a lot of different types of disturbances. And really the interdependent or the overarching theme is often this heterogeneity and the need for variability in the landscape. So I'll hit on that a little bit as well. So in the US, we have this strong push for conservation, and sometimes that includes a discussion of rewilding. And I've never felt totally comfortable with that discussion because it means different things to different people. But in the environments that I work in, the debates are often over which herbivore you should use. And the conclusion is that, well, as long as we can get people out of the system, then you put some of the herbivores back in the landscape that were there, then you can everything will be better. And in reality, it's much more complex than that. And I tried to highlight that in this paper. I actually tried to go back, and the main point I wanted to make about this paper, is that, or in this paper, is that humans have been a part of these systems for a long time. And for example, in the US, everyone wants to try and make the land look like it did in 1491, which is the magical year in the US. And in reality, they do not understand that Native American people were managing the land. And in fact, another thing that happened in the airport is I found an article yesterday that said even Neanderthals were managing landscapes and altering the vegetation. So to discuss systems without people being a part of it is really, in my opinion, not a very productive approach. And in fact, in the US, we had 15,000 years, and it was highly variable, but of people using fire mostly to manage landscapes. That was the primary factor. And often when we have these discussions, people will say, well, how often did this system naturally burn? And the idea is, well, without fire or without people, how often would it burn? But in reality, it's been burning for a long time because of people. And an example, just to make that point, is that people also made bison, North American bison, the dominant animal in North America. And they did this through hunting and manipulating the landscape. So if you're going to say fire is out because people were lighting it, then you also have to say bison are out and almost everything else that we like in this world. So the main point of that paper is that there's more to this than just putting one herbivore back in the landscape. It's actually really complex, and I used sort of this diagram to outline that paper, where there's a strong human domain and it's changed substantially over time, but there's also a biophysical domain, which is what I typically study. And then in the US, at least, there's this heavy focus on which herbivore should be on the landscape, which matters because sometimes we're interested in doing conservation of one animal. But more importantly is the integration of all of these into a sort of conservation model that can be productive. So also, and several people on this trip have mentioned this several times, but fire has been, up until a few hundred years ago, fire was a dominant tool in most regions of the world, arguably. And we've done a pretty good job over the last, depending on where you are, 100 to 500 years of suppressing that. And in reality, there's a great book. It's mostly about cooking, but I sort of extend it to include the use of fire in general, but that says the way we became human is through the use of fire and the use of cooking and these sorts of things to get more calories so that, you know, we can run whatever it is that we have. So we've stopped that in the US. We've largely, you'll laugh when I say this, but we've largely effectively stopped fires in the US. That's changing. And certainly you can watch the news about California. But one example is most of land management agencies are included in this group, as well as the Nature Conservancy, which is a nonprofit. They are focused on trying to figure out how much fire occurred historically and how much fire has been changed over time. And they found that 3/4 of the US lands are moderately to severely departed from historical conditions because we've eliminated fire. And so that suggests that that's a tool that if we want to go forward, we can talk about that, or why we are seeing some of the things that change. We should also try to understand if that might be associated with fire. And in fact, with some of my former students that are now professors, Drac Twidwell and Brady Allred, we evaluated we have these ecological site descriptions, and they're based on expert opinion. And they come up with these transitions that cause state changes. And we analyzed all of those data that are based on professionals within the community and found that the dominant drivers, one way or the other, are woody plants. Woody plants are really what make questions about land management. It's all about woody plants. Well, 70% of the time. And so the colors here, if it's blue, that means 80 to 100% of the models in that area recognize those factors as main drivers in state change. So the point here is that even expert opinion recognizes that the dominant threat is woody plants. The main woody plant that is of interest in the central part of North America are juniperous species. Often they're referred to as cedar. It's an evergreen and can invade grasslands or woodlands or shrublands or savannas. It doesn't really matter. And it has a lot of implications, and I'm going to talk briefly about some of those. It can eventually lead to essentially no other vegetation. So you can have a homogenization of a plant community from the encroachment of woody plants. So as I mentioned, I like to start thinking about how people interact. And that doesn't mean I'm going to become a social scientist, because I really couldn't do that even if I wanted to. But what I am really interested in is this socio-ecological perspective, because I think it changes the kinds of questions that we ask. This is sort of a simplistic, standardized model that helps you organize discussions, where what I have traditionally done is shown in the green box. And what social scientists do is shown in the blue box. And then I think what's really interesting are these boxes in the middle that affect both and are affected by both, and how these feedback loops happen. So I am not going, when I started putting this talk together, every time I start to talk about this, I end up with 300 slides that are about the green box, because that's what I've mostly worked on, but that's really not why I'm talking about this here. So I'm going to resist talking a lot about the green box and just say that we know how many seeds this plant produces, what happens to the other plants when it increases, how fast it grows, how it responds to fire. It's very sensitive to fire, and it basically grows fairly quickly. You can become a grassland to a woodland in 40 to 50 years, potentially. So we know a lot about that box. We also have social scientists that have studied the blue box. What we haven't talked a lot about is how these fit together. And I'm going to briefly talk about this. So an example, I had a wonderful postdoc from South Africa, Reinhard Schultz, and a mentor, Steve Archer. We got together and used some large data sets to try and find out the potential woody plant cover that could occur within the southern part of the region. And what we found is there's this high dependency. There's a strong gradient from the east to the west of decreasing rainfall. And along that gradient, most of the gradient can support a fairly dense closed canopy woodland. In fact, this synthesizes this. The green line represents the potential woody cover that can occur within that landscape. So many of these landscapes are traditionally grasslands, but they can support over 50% woody cover. Now, when you get to the more drier regions, they still can support a substantial amount of woody vegetation, but it does start to decline. Now, the interesting point here that's from a socio-ecological standpoint is that almost nowhere does it reach the potential. So as an ecologist, I could write a paper and say, what is the potential? But it's also important to recognize that the potential is almost never met, which is a good thing. That means there are people that are doing stuff to keep this from happening. And so these things can be very different. They can be very agricultural focused, or in some regions, they may even be wildlife management or conservation focused. And so it's really interesting to try and find out these kinds of questions where you might ask, what is it that is driving these people to make decisions, either not to do anything about it or to positively do something about it? So that means we need to focus. I don't know if you can see it, but the yellow and the brown spot in the middle, and more importantly, the little transitions are the arrows, H3 and H4 and H1 and H6, and also H7. Those are really what we need to understand when we think about a socio-ecological system. And I will just briefly talk about some of these. Again, I sometimes get carried away, and I've tried to force myself to stay really focused on the big picture here. So if we go back to that model and focus on the yellow, that's why I have the yellow heading, and we ask ecosystem services, we have started collecting a lot of data on what these ecosystem services are that grasslands provide versus woodlands. And then we'll later we are even talking about how does Pyric herbivory contribute to that. But just to quickly summarize, we have documented a 6-fold decline in livestock production from woody plant encroachment. There's not many things that impact livestock production as much as maybe the weather can, but mostly we have This is one of the primary drivers that limit how much livestock production we can have. If you're not interested in livestock, we've also documented several endangered species that the primary driver is the encroachment of woody plants. In our region, there are also economically important wildlife, mostly for hunting, but also for ecotourism. They are largely influenced by woody plant encroachment. Water is somewhat in debate. There's no doubt that woody plant encroachment has a major effect on the water cycle. Whether it leads to a lot less water for urban communities or not depends on where you are. There are cases where woody plant encroachment has dramatically decreased the amount of water available for people to consume. And so it can have a significant effect to the water cycle, and I'd be happy to talk more about that. When you start to get out of the system and think about some ecosystem services that might be very important, no one wants to see children that are ill, and these juniperous plants in this particular case produce some very big problems with people that have allergies and asthma. And it's having an impact all the way to some of the largest cities in North America, because the pollen is wind driven and very easy to transport. Estelle Leviton is a friend from Tulsa, and she's one of the leaders in understanding how these changes in ecosystems can change this pollen environment, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. We also have a lot of data on wildfire danger, and generally speaking, a juniperous tree, on most days, it will not burn unless you stick a torch in the middle of it, because it holds quite a bit of water. But when it starts to get dry, it becomes very volatile, and it almost explodes. So under dry conditions, when we have severe wildfires, this plant becomes a real serious problem. And then finally, I have a paper coming out in a few weeks. It's actually in 2022, where we've summarized the effects globally and documented that increase in woody plants has led to disease vectors that affect human health, specifically things like mosquitoes and ticks. So the point is that this change is not just about agricultural production. While that's very important, it's also affecting a lot of other things within the whole region that affect people that may not even be associated with land management. So one of the points that we've made in this, and I'm sorry that this is a simplistic figure, but just to try and make a general point, you can have intensively managed landscapes like urban, maybe a park in an urban area, or very intensive agriculture for, say, fruits and vegetables. It tends to happen on small properties that have high economic value and maybe high cultural value as well. But mostly it's driven primarily by economics, especially from the farming standpoint in urban areas and so forth. On the other end, you can have national parks and things like that are natural. They tend to be large areas, and they're very important also from a societal perspective. And I think the point is that many of the lands, at least that I work on, sort of fit in the middle there. They aren't strongly economically, people don't make a lot of money off of those, in spite of what a lot of people think. And then they also don't think about them sometimes, at least in the US, as important from a societal perspective. And so sometimes it kind of falls through the gaps. And in reality, it often makes up the majority of many of the places that we might work. So we're trying through some of these efforts just to get people to think more about the potential of these landscapes to provide societal benefits as well as economic benefits. Okay, so if we think about those issues of H3 and H4, we can study and we can do surveys, and we've done some of those about how people perceive some of the things that we're talking about. And they're often very responsive. But we can also talk about some of these other things. For example, so if we back up here, oops, sorry. So if we move up to the brown box, so people respond to ecosystem services in theory, and in theory, some people respond by applying management practices that we're calling, in this case, disturbance patterns. But in reality, it could be more. But at least in the work I've done, why do some people burn and some people do not burn? This is actually a prescribed fire in an area where they probably should have done this a long time ago, because it's created, the only way you're going to get this to burn is under very harsh conditions like this was. Most people don't want to see a fire like this in their neighborhood. And I would argue the reason that there's many reasons why this is such a big fire, but the biggest one is probably because they didn't burn for years when the trees were small and there were very few of them, that now they have to burn under extreme conditions or not at all, and let wildfire take care of it. But we've done a lot of studies, and I'm not going to go through all of them. This is just one example from some colleagues that highlights across the top, we have different sizes of land, acres, pardon that, basically divide by 2, or will get you in the ballpark, 160 acres or less to burn when you have no trees, no cedar is what that is. It's about $10 an acre. If you get up to over 5,000 acres, in this case, it's $3 an acre. So the size of land matters, but also the number of trees on that land matters as you go vertical. And in fact, at some point, fire stops working very well. And so just to show you how this plays out over the long term, if you look at economics, this is over more than a decade. We have 2 landscapes, if you will. The bottom one goes from 10 to near 0 in economic value. The top one stays, it's variable with year-to-year variation, but it's maintained fairly high. Well, what's the difference? Those were prescribed fires conducted in the top. So it's having a major economic impact. It's stabilizing rural communities. Wildfire can destabilize rural communities. So an important question that some have asked is, well, why do some people not use fire? So if this data is out there, why wouldn't people do it? And the survey points to a few major things and some minor. And basically, what we found was that there are some serious concerns, and they're legitimate concerns. But in a bigger picture, what we found is that if we fix the top one and find a way that they can avoid doing this and can even create insurance where if they have an accident, it's covered, the majority of the people that don't burn just move down and pick the next one. So it's kind of like they've already decided they are not going to burn, and they're looking for reasons to do that. Now, there's others that have legitimate and have the potential to change, but they have legitimate reasons, and understanding those are something that we're trying to do a little more of. We have some social scientists on our team. I put this graph up because we also have some economists, and I'm on these papers and I don't have any idea what they're about, to be honest. I mean, we were part of a team. I understand what they're about. I viewed my role as sort of the interpreter to explain to the rest of the ecological world what these papers were actually about. And this is from a friend that was an economist, or is an economist. The main point is that if you think of the world as you have burners, people who burn, and then if the fire gets away, you have victims because people have their property burned, then how much risk is the burner supposed to absorb versus how much benefit does the entire community or versus the burner face? So you've got this risk versus benefit. If the person that's doing the burning has all the risk, but the benefit is to a larger community, and we ask, well, why won't more people do this? The reason is because they have to absorb all the risk. That risk should be spread out over the community who is enjoying those benefits. That doesn't mean, so on the one hand, that's the case. That doesn't mean we want people throwing matches out on really bad days and causing extreme wildfires. But if we want more controlled, safe fires, we have to find a way, because fire is complex, we have to find a way to absorb that risk into the entire community. And former student working for me, we came up with this this project, and it's kind of hard to say. This is more about fire sciences, but the point we want to make on this graph is the orange bar there represents the range of historical conditions under which fires could have occurred. So it's fairly big. The green represents what increasing in trees does to the potential range of fires that can occur under prescribed fire setting. So, and the three graphs are rate of spread, fire line intensity, and flame length, which are all essentially getting at to the intensity of a fire. And so the point is that trees can have a big impact on the the intensity of fire, shown in the green. But the biggest effect is in the purple, and that is the regulations to burn restrict when people can burn, causing the fires to largely be ineffective. So even in some of the areas where we're allowing fire and even promoting fire, we're only allowing it to happen under conditions which it largely doesn't do very much. And so that's another sort of social, ecological concern. And people are trying to find ways to get through that without creating a very dangerous situation. So the main point here is represented by the graphic on the left. So the top axis shows the ecological environment that favors a grassy landscape. It could be a savanna or even an open woodland. So if you're at 1, then you're not going to have that. If you're at 2, then there's an ecological suitability for that to exist. But of equal importance is the vertical axis, where the culture is geared it's geared to a woodland at the top versus it is accepting of the things that go with grasslands at the bottom. The only place in the world that you can have a landscape dominated by grasslands is 4. You not only have to have the ecological conditions that are suited, but you also have to have the social conditions that are suited. And in fact, I would argue those are probably more important, at least on our contemporary landscapes. So in trying to talk about fire, and fire and woody plants sort of go hand in hand, Drac Twidwell and I came up with and developed a paper that just came out not too long ago. It's actually not in press anymore, but where we try to talk about what's happened in North America. And we basically, the picture here is a real event from Frederick Remington, is an American artist. And he supposedly witnessed this. There was a wildfire. They killed a cow and cut it, split it open, and drug it behind horses trying to put the fire out. And the point that I want to make is we went to a lot of trouble to put fires out for a really long time. And so we came up with this, trying to discuss this as a socio-ecological problem. And we talk about fire in a coexistence era. So this is largely Native Americans. Fire is a dominant land use tool. They say there are 70 reasons that they use fire that are documented. And I noticed when I read those 70 that one was not included, and that was just for enjoyment. You know, if you live in a fire landscape, in fact, there are historical documentations of people being bored, so they lit the prairie on fire. And so that was a very different environment than we have now. Then we went into this all-out suppression. Let's kill all fires as quickly as possible. And that's lasted, in the US at least, it's been 150 to 200 years, depending on where you are. And then we call this shadow era, and many of you people in here that have lit fires would count as part of the shadow era. That means there are people that are trying to use it again, but they aren't a major part of the landscape. And then we argue now, it doesn't really matter whether you like fire or not, we're going to have fire. And in fact, yesterday, while we were on the bus, I was looking at information from back home, and they were having really severe wildfires in Texas and Oklahoma. So this just happens every year now, and it never happened when I was younger. So we've largely been very effective at creating this, and it's not entirely due to our management. It's also due to climate change, which I suppose, broadly speaking, could be part of our management. But we've also had intensive marketing campaigns, and arguably one of the most successful is Smokey the Bear. Although, but there were many, and there's some justification for this. So I'm not trying to only say this is bad, but I think this happens a lot in the media where we oversimplify a message to try and get a point across. And it's very typical of certainly the US. It's all about marketing and marketing what you believe is right. The other big issue we face now is that our landscapes are changing. This is a landscape along the border of Oklahoma and Texas that used to be amazing prairie. Now, if you get between some of those little white specks, it's still amazing prairie, but the white dots all represent oil wells. And this has and each one of those wells has a road that has to drive to it. So we've taken a landscape that was vast and largely unfragmented, although there's also some cropland in there. And most of this occurred, this study was Brady Allred, and it looked at the first decade of the 2000s. And how many oil wells were drilled. And we lost as much forage in the central part of the US that would support all of the grazing in the Western US from energy development. So energy development is not something we can ignore, and it's a part of these cultural landscapes. And it's variable. The whole world, I picked a really bad spot for this picture, but the point is that it is present and a strong issue that is driving land management. The other thing that happens in the US is that we have some agencies that give money to try and control woody plants. And this is a recent study by Reinhardt again that looks at these locations and the different things, chemical, mechanical, prescribed fire, or wildfire that have occurred across the region, and ask which ones were the most effective and where did they occur most frequently. The bottom line is most of the ones that were shared, cost shared by the government were such mild disturbances that they had very little impact. The biggest impact was wildfire. And so wildfire is really the thing that's probably most likely to save some of our grassland landscapes. So to sort of end on a more positive note, I want to talk a little more about, so what do we do about this? So you know, sometimes I've heard it said that one thing bad about being an ecologist is that, you know, if you're not careful, people will not want you to come around very often, because oftentimes you have a lot of bad news but as the world changes, and that's just something that tends to happen. So we try and think, especially when we're thinking about these socio-ecological, what can we do about this? So how do we have rural economies? Heterogeneity, which I haven't talked about as much today, but heterogeneity, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it, is the basis of conservation, arguably. So how do we have these ecosystem services, and then conserve these grassy landscapes and biomes? Whole biomes are altering. And our equivalent of this group, I think, I don't know that they're equivalent, but we're trying to do similar things. We call the Prairie Project. It's not always prairie. In fact, it's usually not prairie, which in our environment means sort of an open grassland with native plants. Oftentimes it's a savanna or shrubland. But how do you conserve that? And we came together for the region and put together a project. And the main focus is doing Pyric herbivory, which I'll talk just briefly about to make sure I cover that. And then we also have multi-species grazing. So the last stop, I talked a lot about Pyric herbivory, and over the week, I've talked about why do we, who's the foolish person that made this word up, and that would be me. But I mostly did it for scientists. It wasn't actually intended to be something that everyone would connect with. I was having a hard time of communicating with scientists more than I was having a hard time with the general public. That's not always the case, but the idea was I wanted to talk about fire and grazing interacting in a way where animals or at least the unit of animals can decide, do they want to graze a burned area or an unburned area? And they're in the same landscape. So it's not always burned and it's not always unburned. It's both of those. So when animals have both of those available, they do a lot better. And I'll briefly show you some data. So we came up with this perspective where heterogeneity, variability, if you prefer, is the center question. We need variability on the landscape. That needs to be driven by fire and grazing. But also that influences fire and grazing through the feedback mechanisms. And this is what creates many of the ecosystem services that we might be interested in. And so in a simple prairie, and this is a fairly productive prairie, although we've done it in very dry environments as well. If you burn an area, you move to the left. So that's 1 to 12 months since fire. But we can't call it fire, because those areas get highly selected by grazing animals. Has a high probability once it's short and burned to be selected by grazing animals. On the other end of the spectrum, you have a prairie that hasn't been burned or grazed, or a patch that hasn't been burned or grazed for several years. And then you have parts that are in transition. So you have this full range of heterogeneity out across the landscape. So if you take that, we can briefly, we have a strong impact on breeding birds. And just to quickly walk through this, killdeer and lark sparrow are birds that like really short vegetation that's been burned and heavily grazed. You have to have that if you're going to have these species. Henslow sparrows like areas that haven't been burned or grazed for 3 years. And then there's the others in the middle. The only way you can have all of them is to have that full range. So we're focused on trying to find ways of doing that. This is breeding birds. We've looked at winter birds. We've looked at small mammals. Prairie chickens, that's the big bird that does the breeding display that you may have seen. It's a beautiful bird, has these orange sacs on its neck. If my phone rings, we may hear one. And then we've also looked at nutrient cycling, water, insects. At the same time that we've done this, because we're working with landowners, we're measuring things that they, not only are they interested in, but their livelihood is dependent upon. And that is largely livestock production. And the top left shows heterogeneity-based management versus traditional uniform. So traditionally, land in the US has been managed. You don't want to disturb anything too heavily, and you don't want to disturb, have stuff that is undisturbed. You want to push everything to the middle. And that does not create biodiversity. And in this case, it actually leads to lower production from a livestock perspective. The others are examples. The top right shows that you get greater stability in livestock production. You are no longer, it decouples rainfall and livestock production when you have variable patches. And then the bottom one is just the variability in vegetation structure. As you increase the variability in space, you get less variability from year to year. So again, we're less dependent upon high variability in the climate. We've also worked with a lot of wildlife people, and we've done these thermal studies. And this, I don't want to spend too much time on this because nobody asked for me to talk about this, but it's something kind of fun that we've worked on. So if we look at, if you go to temperatures or a weather station and you look at weather data, that's what's represented on the bottom. So say when it's 30 C at the weather station, when you go out across the landscape and measure operative temperature, if you were an organism at the ground right there, what would you feel? You can be at less than 30 C, as low as maybe even all the way down to the lower 20s, but you can also be all the way up to 60 C. So the spread of points across that is an indication of heterogeneity. If that graph were real tight, which is what we usually want in science, I suggest that's not what we should want. We should want the opposite. We should want this high degree of variability because that's what allows multiple organisms to live out there. And plus, when an animal deals with stress, whether it's livestock or wild, it has to have somewhere different to go. If everything's the same, then it has nowhere different to go. And we've developed an idea from that we've called pinch point ecology. And the idea is that the highest mortality in our environment occurs mostly under extreme heat in the summer. In this case, we're talking about a very important, economically important wildlife species. Well, when you map what its habitat is, that's shown in all the colors on the map. Then you get, they can use most of this area. But when you look when it's most extremely hot, they only use the areas in red, and most extremely cold, I only use the areas in blue. So the point is we have to have heterogeneity under these extreme conditions for this organism to persist on this landscape. This group that we're putting together focused on Pyric herbivory has had an impact. This is a real world landscape in an environment that we work where a rancher was willing to put in Pyric herbivory, which is the lower pasture. The one that is heavily wooded above is one where he did not do Pyric herbivory. And so you can see in a mere 20 years, these started out nearly the same. The awkward color in the middle of the picture is the most recently burned patch. And so this rancher has been able to get livestock production off of his land, periodically perform very safe prescribed burns. The next burn he does will burn into the burn patch. So it's very safe and able to limit woody plant encroachment. Whereas if he did not do that, you would have the situation above. And oddly enough, the situation above has had a wildfire through it in the middle of this study. So it reduced woody cover, but it didn't entirely eliminate it. The other issue we're going to focus on, or we have focused on, is using different species for different reasons, grazing species. And specifically, goats, sheep, and cattle, although we also study bison, elk, horses in this environment. But the big ones are that most people use are cattle, sheep, and goats. And just to highlight that they all have different habitat requirements. We don't think of it always as habitat, but it's true. They also have very different effects. Oops. So a couple of positive notes. The other thing that's happening is we're having this development of these fire cooperatives where landowners, if you're a landowner or rancher in our environment, you can join a cooperative, and if you help other people burn, then they will help you burn. And we've been very successful at establishing these. Some of them are very effective. The dots represent areas that where these cooperatives have been formed. Some of them are much less effective, but in general, they are capable of even modifying political environments if you get the right people in the cooperative. Other things have happened. We've formed these sort of pseudo-government organizations that are largely focused on disseminating information about fire. These are called, fire science exchange units. And then I think I will just conclude by saying that well, first of all, this is Lana Lowe. She's the director of First Nations in British Columbia. And on some of our projects, they were integral in conducting the fires and are very interested in it being a part of maintaining their culture. But I really want to say that certainly when we talk about fire, but also even when we just talk about ecosystems in general, understanding people is the most important part, and trying to come up with solutions that people can actually apply needs to be a major focus of what we do. And that's one of the reasons I'm happy to be here, is that this seems like that's exactly what's happening here. And I'm really excited to meet everyone, and I look forward to seeing the sites and enjoying more interaction. So thank you. I don't know if we have time for questions, or a few minutes for questions if I will need. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. ¿Hay alguna pregunta? ¿No hay nadie que quiera preguntar algo?
Thank you very much, Sam, for the excellent presentation you made. I'm very, I mean, it's like a kind of paradigm of fire. We are all of us are seeing fires as something wrong, something that is not good for nature. And so, however, you have shown some results that says that is part of the management. It is very difficult. I mean, we saw that when you have an encroachment, you have a dominant species that reduces a lot of biodiversity. But people understand that these type of areas should be strongly protected and not disturbed at all. Yeah. Even in spite of the evolution they can have to forest lands, which means their own destruction. But it's not just only public, it's something that is shared by a lot of professors and at the university. So how do, my question is more about how can we change that mind from the side of to make this possible? That's my question. How do you think are the main steps we should do to change this? Thank you.
That's a great question, and so I think this is a really big important issue that you point out. It seems like the root of this is sort of the philosophy that humans are not doing good things or haven't done good. And clearly there are places where we have done some bad things. So that's not, it's easy to see how someone could develop that opinion. But the best example that I have from where I have been is, well, there's two really quick examples. One's Yellowstone National Park, which is a beautiful park in the US that's important. In 1988, 40% of it burned in a wildfire. Diversity, animals, and in fact, not long after that, they introduced the wolf. And you'll often hear of the many great things that the wolf reintroduction did, and it did. I'm not arguing, but it's confounded because that is almost the exact same time that 40% of the park burned. So you really can't separate those two factors because animals started grazing in different places. There was a lot of changes in the distribution, and that could be due to wolves or fire. And everyone, well, I don't know about everyone, but most of the people that worked for Yellowstone know that that was a really good thing. And they still can't act on it because it's so politically. When people go with their families to a national park, they don't want it to be on fire. I mean, that's understandable, but it creates a really big challenge. And I think it may even perpetuate some of the negative response. So some of the parks have started putting up plaques that explain this really well. And I think that's really a good step in the right direction, but I would like to see them have even more educational outreach about that. And so that's one example. The other example that just sort of confirms what you said, in a crater in Africa, they wanted to save the rhino, and they released but the people that lived there, which they raised livestock, they also burned very frequently. So they made a park. They removed the people, which were indigenous people, and because that's what you do when you make a park, I guess. And then what happened is all the rhinos died. And the reason, and this is well documented by Winston Trollope, who's a good friend of mine. The reason is that they stopped burning. And when they stopped burning, they had an explosion of ticks. And the ticks led to what it's blood, urine with blood in it, which they call it red water, or the in their language. Redwater disease started killing all of these animals. And it was really because they removed these people that were a part of that system from that landscape. And so they've now put them back or allowed them to come back. And so there are small examples where we're fixing it, but I think that is an important thing that we need to do, is reach out to urban audiences that might have very different backgrounds, as well as rural communities. Thank you.
Has hablado del fuego, pero también has hablado un poquito del herbívoro y has comentado que una de las cosas que planteabais era pastoreos por diferentes especies animales, pastoreos mixtos. Quería preguntarte un poco si tenéis experiencias precisamente utilizando animales domésticos y experiencias también con bisontes, con búfalos. ¿Y cuál es tu opinión, ¿no?, sobre el hecho de introducir animales salvajes para esa función de pastoreo? Al menos, ¿qué experiencias tenéis allí?
Great, great. So, thank you for that. I have a lot of, well, I don't know if it's a lot. I have experience in that. In fact, the early part of my career, I worked, one of the first papers I published says that it's about fire and grazing. In reality, there was no fire data in the paper. And in fact, I wrote a review article with a friend some years ago where we synthesized all the fire data, and we had a spreadsheet that had categories where we put each paper into categories. And he called me and said, we have a new category, and it's papers that are about fire that aren't about fire. And your paper is the only one that's in it. And so he was making fun of me because of this. But basically, I started out mostly studying the multi-species question. And because the environment I was working in did not have fire. And the reason I was talking about it in that paper was because the fact that we had removed fire from a fire system meant that one of the primary solutions was to find animals to eat the things that were increasing because of the lack of fire. Now, what we found in that study was that you can do that, and it can have a significant impact, but it doesn't replace fire, just like fire doesn't replace herbivores. So it's sort of like, it's really not the same thing as the interaction. So I do think that as we move forward, our climate's changing, the landscape's changing, we're going to have to graze different animals. And some of those can be traditionally the animals that occurred in a region, and some may have to be domestic. And from a profit standpoint, we've done some economic studies that you can make a lot more money with a mixed herd than you can with just one species. So I have a lot of experience with that. And an example from the early work that I did, you can burn, if you have goats instead of cows, you can burn half as often. Basically, the growth rate of a tree with goats in the pasture, the average growth rate is half of what it would be if you had cows. So they're not independent. And I think that's mostly what I've learned in life, is that fire and grazing are strongly interactive. As far as the native animals, I think that's interesting as well. I've worked a lot with a lot of different native animals. And I think we're finding that we almost need to do the same thing. So I work in one area that the thought was it was strongly bison. There were some of these antelope that were also dominant, but not near as high profile as the bison or the buffalo. And so we're looking at introducing some of these subdominant species into the landscape because some of these browsing plants are really becoming a problem. And so the focus of those areas are largely conservation. So instead of trying to go back to 1491, which is what most people are trying to do in the States, we're arguing we can still use the native herbivores, but we need to move forward and modify the proportion relative to the vegetation that's actually on the landscape. I do think there's a great potential with both domestic and native species to modify the species. And one more quick example. Not too long ago, in the same week, I had a landowner call me that had nothing but grass on his land. And he wanted to know what to plant to grow, to have goats. And in the same week, I had a rancher call me and he had tons of woody plants and he wanted to know what he could spray on those so that he could grow more grass so that he could graze his cows. So I just gave each other's phone number and said, you should switch. And the point is the practice is supposed to be matching the herbivore to the environment, not matching the environment to the herbivore, because there's only so much you can do. But I think that's a fun subject to talk about. Thank you.